focusing on helping the United States respond to 4 interconnected challenges: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, conflict and humanitarian crisis, and democratic backsliding. Additionally, Administrator Power is the first USAID administrator to be a member of the US National Security Council. Prior to this, Administrator Power was the Anna Lid Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the William Zabel Professor of Practice in Human Rights at Harvard Law School. From 2013 to 2017, Administrator Power served in the Obama-Biden administration as the 28th US Permanent Representative to the United Nations. An immigrant from Ireland, Administrator Power began her career as a war correspondent in Bosnia. She has been recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people. She's an author and editor of multiple books and the recipient of the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. I would like to now invite Administrator Power to the podium to deliver keynote remarks, which will then be followed by a moderated Q&A facilitated by Keshav Gupta. Over to you, Administrator Power.
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm sorry we're getting a slightly late start. I am thrilled to be here at IIT Delhi. I want to thank Dean Garg for that introduction and for welcoming me to this legendary institution. An institution so legendary, in fact, that it must have been tough to choose which Bhatnagar Prize winner would kick us off today. The list of successful companies founded by graduates from the Indian Institute of Technology, both in America and here in India, seems endless. The technical breakthroughs discovered here, from mathematics to quantum mechanics to computer science, are frankly too numerous for me to mention, and certainly way too complex for me to try to describe. So let me start by acknowledging what should be very obvious to all of you. There is absolutely no way that I ever could have gotten into IIT. No way. I'm especially pleased to be speaking here today because the partnership between this institution and the United States is making a profound difference in the world. It really is. Last year, my agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, launched the SAMRIID Public Health Initiative, hosted by IIT Delhi, an initiative to bring $250 million in public and private capital together so that marginalized and remote communities can access breakthroughs in medical care. Healthcare entrepreneurs and companies want to reach those most in need. But let's face it, they have often lacked the capital necessary. SAMRIID has already helped rush oxygen concentrators and ventilators to COVID patients, expand fleets of ambulances to reach remote communities, and supply hand-cranked defibrillators that can work without electricity. And this is just the latest iteration of what we can achieve when we come together. At the dawn of USAID's founding, which is now 61 years ago, we invested in the development of your sister school, IIT Kanpur. With expertise from 9 of America's biggest universities, including MIT, Caltech, and Princeton, we worked together to establish IIT Kanpur's research, laboratories, and academic programs, and helped it, I think, become the first institute to offer computer science education in the entire country. The spark that fueled India's IT boom was one that we are incredibly proud to be associated with. And what is true for USAID and IIT is true of the 75-year partnership between the United States and India. It is no exaggeration to say that the US-India collaboration has been transformational, strengthening both the United States and India, and making the world safer and more prosperous as a result. The United States has worked with the Indian people to eradicate polio, launch educational exchanges, and most notably, tackle the problem of acute hunger and malnutrition. And across our history, some 51% of the nearly $17 billion USAID has invested in India actually went toward food programming, food security. As India embarked upon its development journey decades ago, American support for Indian food security took two forms: emergency food assistance in times of crises, and longer-term investments in India's agricultural economy. When it came to humanitarian food assistance, in 1951, 4 short years after India's independence, the country was rocked by a series of earthquakes, floods, droughts, and even locusts. The United States responded by shipping 2 million tons of grain across the ocean. That was then packed onto dhows and floated down the Ganges throughout the country, sparing millions from the threat of famine. Then in 1967, after a then unprecedented 2 consecutive years of poor monsoon rains, India was again threatened by a food crisis. President Lyndon Johnson sent more than 600 ships to India, carrying more than 40 million tons of grain. This was the largest maritime fleet to hit the world's waters since D-Day, the D-Day landings in Normandy in World War II. While these emergency relief efforts saved lives in their time, the far more enduring partnership between our countries was one dedicated to working with India on its road to becoming an agricultural powerhouse in its own right. From 1956 to 1970, USAID brought more than 2,000 Indian scientists to the United States, increasing the number of Indian PhD students in agriculture by tenfold. We also helped India establish its own network of agricultural universities by partnering them with existing American land-grant institutions. 6 partnerships in total. For instance, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University with the University of Illinois, Punjab Agricultural University with Ohio State University, and we sent more than 300 American professors and agronomists to advise India's own growing agricultural core. Together, Indian and American agricultural scientists developed new strains of wheat and rice that could expand food production. India's legendary Minister for Food and Agriculture at the time, Chidambaram Subramaniam, even dug up a cricket pitch next to his home in Delhi and planted the grounds with new hybrid wheat strains in hopes it would help inspire farmers to do the same. Over 1 million farmers took up his challenge, and within 2 decades, India's wheat output grew by more than 230%. This was the Green Revolution, and it helped India not only become economically self-sufficient in meeting its own food needs, but also supported it as it made itself the world's largest exporter of rice by far, as well as a major exporter now of dairy and fruits and vegetables. India's global agricultural productivity increased in 25 years by more, it is said, than it had in the previous 1,000 years. In 2010, USAID shifted its work in India to other domains, focused on engaging the country's vibrant private sector, improving health outcomes, and empowering women to supercharge its growing economy. Instrumental to these partnerships over the last 7 decades were the more than 2,500 Indian nationals who were directly part of American efforts here. They were USAID's superpower, and some of you are in the audience, and I thank you eternally. Our Foreign Service nationals, our Indian nationals here, brought wisdom, experience, connections, and the deepest understanding of the local context of this diverse and vibrant country. Many have given decades of their lives to working at USAID, and they helped change their country for the better. This is how development partnerships should function. We should work together as partners, exchanging knowledge and contributing necessary resources to expand economic progress and unlock the indigenous potential. And equally as important, the independence of emerging economies. In my remarks today, that is, in fact, what I want to speak about, a new model of development partnership, rooted in the idea that all people deserve dignity and respect, anchored in technological progress and novel solutions that can help us leapfrog establishment development paths, and undergirded by democratic values that can help transform our shared planet for the better. A model through which India can have a profound impact, not just in its own neighborhood, but around the world. When it comes to India's role in international development, many, as you've heard, are quick to label it as an emerging donor. But this characterization is false. Even before independence, India supported the creation of the Afro-Asian Conference, a meeting that laid the groundwork for cooperation between India and various southern countries. Soon thereafter, Prime Minister Nehru argued that the economic development of all countries was an obligation of the international community. This was a philosophy rooted in perhaps the most treasured and important value of Indian society, one engraved on the entrance to India's parliament, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. If I've said it incorrectly, forgive me. As the verse in the Maha Upanishad goes, one is a relative, the other a stranger, say the small-minded. The world is one family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family. And that family, Nehru believed, should be free to live without fear and without despair. That is why, even amidst its own challenges, India established cultural fellowships and trainings, beginning in 1949, offering scholarships to dozens of African and Asian students to study on the subcontinent. It's why in 1951, India joined other nations to launch the Colombo Plan, to invest in the infrastructure, education, and development of South and Southeast Asia, and share policymaking and good governance expertise, an effort that continues to this day. And why India established its first aid mission in Nepal in 1954, followed quickly by direct assistance to other neighbors, including Bhutan and Afghanistan. For 7 decades now, India's legacy of support and cooperation has grown and strengthened into a commitment this past year of $2.3 billion in bilateral development assistance, stretching from East Asia all the way to Latin America. And while the majority of its focus has been on supporting neighboring states, India has never looked away from its partners in Africa. In 1991, when the African Capacity Building Foundation was established to help African nations build up their human capital and their cadre of public servants, India was the first Asian country to join, providing financing and technical assistance. Since the turn of the century, the government of India has provided more than $11 billion in concessional credit for development projects on the continent. It has offered 50,000 scholarships for African students to study at institutions just like this one. In 2003, when India's GDP was almost 1/5 of what it is today, the government wrote off the debts of heavily indebted poor countries, $24 million wiped off the ledgers of Ghana, Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And in medical emergencies, India has quickly raced assistance to hotspots, contributing $12 million, for example, to the UN's response fund during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa back in 2014, something I witnessed firsthand when I was UN ambassador. But perhaps nowhere is India's commitment to those in peril more on display, actually, than right now in Sri Lanka. The economic catastrophe faced by the Sri Lankan people has many sources: economic mismanagement and corruption, unwise agricultural policies, self-inflicted debt burdens, and a tourism sector crushed by COVID. All of this compounded by food and fuel price pressures that all countries are facing has led the government to default on its debt, has led the price of vegetables to double, the cost of basic food staples like rice and fish to skyrocket, and brought about a stunning lack of fuel at any price. Drivers report waiting in long queues for days sometimes to fill up their tanks. And that is in the fortunate circumstances if they can find fuel at all. Before I get to India's really, really important response to this devastating turn of events, let me just say on behalf of President Biden and the American people that our hearts go out to the people of Sri Lanka during this time of great trial. Since the crisis intensified in May, the United States has provided nearly $32 million of development and humanitarian assistance for Sri Lanka to support basic food security, address the immediate needs of communities impacted by the crisis, support a safety net program in the country's schools, equip some 30,000 farmers with seeds and fertilizer, and provide nutritious food to both new and expectant mothers. This brings our total emergency response to Sri Lanka's challenges this year to almost $180 million. And that's in addition to our $30 to $40 million annual development portfolio to assist the country and the people more broadly so that these kinds of shocks don't keep happening. And India has reacted really swiftly with an absolutely critical set of measures. The government of India has already supplied $16 million in humanitarian aid to Sri Lanka. It has exported 100,000 tons of organic fertilizer to try to help farmers stave off future food shortages. And it has supplied $3.5 billion in lines of credits to the government of Sri Lanka as it attempts to steer its economy out of default and further collapse. Contrast this with the People's Republic of China, which has been an increasingly eager creditor of Sri Lankan governments since the mid-2000s. Indeed, over the past 2 decades, China became one of Sri Lanka's biggest creditors, offering often opaque loan deals at higher interest rates than other lenders, and financing a raft of headline-grabbing infrastructure projects with often questionable practical use for Sri Lankans, including a massive port that generated little income and was barely used by ships, an equally massive airport dubbed the emptiest in the world because it attracted so few passengers, and the country's tallest tower that was built as a tourist attraction, yet has never, unfortunately, opened to the public. Now that economic conditions have soured, Beijing has promised lines of credit and emergency loans. This is critical, since Beijing is estimated to hold at least 15% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. But calls to provide more significant relief have so far gone unanswered. And the biggest question of all is whether Beijing will restructure debt to the same extent as other bilateral creditors. I've had many conversations here in India and with other partners. This challenge is not unique to Sri Lanka. Many debt-distressed countries in Africa and Asia are hoping that their calls will be answered. It is really essential that Beijing participate in debt relief transparently and on equitable terms with all other creditors. If ever there were a time to choose cooperation, that time is now. The world's low and middle-income countries have been devastated by COVID-19, their fiscal space largely spent trying to help their citizens weather a public health emergency. Indeed, some 60% of low-income countries are facing or already experiencing debt distress. At the same time, climate shocks, as you well know, are walloping wealthy and poor countries at the same time. Each day, we bear witness to a new temperature record never seen before, as occurred last week in the United Kingdom. Each planting season, we steel ourselves for a weaker harvest, as happened this year in India when the March heat wave brought the highest average temperatures recorded in 122 years, reducing this country's wheat crop. Each year, countries all around the world prepare for a previously inconceivable drought. To illustrate just how intense these climate swings have been, New Delhi, as you all know, in the last 6 months has seen its hottest week on record, its coldest week on record, and its wettest week on record. Before coming to India, I traveled to Somalia and to Kenya, countries that inhabit a region that is suffering an unprecedented 4 straight seasons of drought, 4 straight failed rainy seasons. And they are bracing themselves for what is likely to be a 5th failed rainy season. With nearly 19 million people now in the region in need of emergency food assistance and 7 million livestock already dead in this drought, killed in this drought, the Horn is the epicenter of a global food crisis, the scale of which has not been seen in recent memory. It is a crisis that threatens the lives and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. The effects of the drought in the Horn of Africa, along with climate stresses in the Sahel and in southern Africa, would be cause for widespread alarm on their own. But the suffering that they have wrought has been compounded by the war in Ukraine. Like India, Ukraine is a global breadbasket, exporting nearly 50 million tons of wheat each year. Therefore, it was no surprise that the invasion and the blockade on 20 million tons of food trapped still in Ukraine's ports coincided with the highest prices ever seen on the UN's Global Food Price Index. The United States, with our partners around the world, have coordinated a massive global response to the food crisis in hopes of preventing another famine from emerging in Africa and in the hopes of limiting the secondary effects of Putin's war. At a time when the world is in need of more humanitarian aid than ever before, the United States is on track to provide more than $11 billion to respond to global needs. This is a staggering amount that I am immensely grateful to the U.S. Congress for coming together to agree upon, and it is an amount that continues to climb. That amount of effectively emergency humanitarian assistance is $3.5 billion more than we were able to provide last year, and last year's was already 40% more than the year before that. These are other records that are being shattered. We recognize that now is a time for unprecedented action. But just as we learned in our work in India long ago, what countries need to unlock their true potential is not merely aid. That can help at the outset and it can help in an emergency. But what countries seek and what they need are investments that put communities in the position to trade. Trade, not aid. The US has just increased our annual $1 billion investment in global food security programming, longer term programming, by an additional $760 million for this year. This we will use with our partners out in the world to help farmers get access to financing, to help them get drought-tolerant seeds that some have but too few have, given that they're available, fertilizer methods to prevent food loss and waste, and to target fertilizer in a more precise way, and market access. As the scale of this crisis is beyond any one nation's ability to solve, we have also engaged in concerted diplomacy at the UN and bilaterally to mount a global response. We've drafted a roadmap for action, encouraging countries to provide humanitarian assistance, invest critically in this long-term agricultural productivity, and limit harmful export restrictions that have the tendency to leave both the countries that issue them and the world's poor worse off. Faced with such an extraordinary global food crisis, every country must examine its budgets and policies so that even as we each address domestic needs and contingencies, and we know how significant those needs are in many parts of the world, including here, we work together to stave off a much wider catastrophe. Sri Lanka's government was the first to fall. There have already been protests related to food and fuel prices in at least 17 countries because of inflationary pressures. If history is any guide, we know that Sri Lanka's government will likely not be the last to fall. Across these past 75 years, India has always shown itself to be a friend to the world's poor. Now, when the stakes have rarely been higher, India stands able to be an incredibly impactful development leader. Because the truth is, as much as the United States has tried to do through the decades to promote economic development, to support marginalized communities around the world, we know how much India has to offer in places where we have not yet made the headway that we would have all wished to have seen, or in places where development strides were taken, but they have now been rolled back by COVID, conflict, and climate change. I cannot think of a moment in history where we have more needed India's know-how on how to lift people out of poverty, India's technological entrepreneurship and prowess, or India's core belief that countries and the people of those countries should be the ones to benefit from their own economic development. As the world develops new vaccines against coronaviruses, malaria, dengue fever, and hopefully HIV/AIDS, it can supplement the kind of vaccine distribution we saw in the US, which was anchored by pharmacies and clinics, with mobile and decentralized vaccination campaigns that are able to reach people in remote locations. Here in India, USAID partnered with the government to equip mobile vaccination vans, repurposed military vehicles, and even camels that were able to reach 500,000 people with COVID vaccines in less than 2 months. I can't tell you how many countries would like to emulate that track record. To counter COVID, the government also embarked on a massive health outreach program, remotely training more than 100,000 workers from around the world, a model they now hope to share with other bilateral partners, and which we certainly stand to learn from. Take election administration. Populous, decentralized countries can follow the lead of the world's largest democracy, harnessing technology and employing poll workers who traverse farmlands, deserts, and jungles to collect votes over weeks. And countries seeking to develop their own agriculture can leapfrog the resource-intensive mechanized farming that is so familiar in Western countries and instead take advantage of new, climate-smart, sustainable techniques like drip irrigation, off-grid powered cold storage, precision fertilizer application, and satellite and drone monitoring, techniques that many Indian farmers are embracing today. One specific area of innovation that we committed to is agroforestry, agriculture that incorporates tree planting to mitigate emissions, provides extra revenue to farmers, and enriches soils. Today, I'm pleased to say that we will soon launch a new partnership with the government of India alongside India's farmers, private companies, and research institutions to invest $25 million in a new tree planting initiative to boost the practice of agroforestry, an effort that can fight climate change and boost farmer income today while accruing critical knowledge that can be brought to bear throughout the world. In fact, so many of the partnerships that USAID has recently engaged in with India, whether the regional integration of electricity grids to facilitate the transfer of clean energy between Nepal and India, or a partnership to export Indian-derived maternal and child health solutions to Nigeria and Bangladesh, come from the understanding that the future of development in the Global South entails applying lessons and insights from the inspiring growth that has already occurred in the Global South. This means, practically speaking, that one of the most effective things that the United States can do to advance economic opportunity and dignity around the world is partner with India in its efforts to share its expertise with third countries. That is a significant reason we have fully supported the government's leadership in the founding of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, a coalition I have the privilege of co-chairing. We have made a multi-year investment in CDRI's secretariat, embedding key technical specialists in its leadership and together spearheading new research endeavors that will help other countries safeguard their infrastructure amidst a changing climate. Through this coalition, we will provide technical support for renewable energy projects in the Caribbean that can keep the lights on and power healthcare facilities even when storms hit. New rural schools in Malawi that won't flatten in the event of an earthquake, and cold storage systems in Bangladesh to preserve the 30% of agricultural harvests still lost each year due to inadequate infrastructure. There is no question that India, with all of its ingenuity, all of its talent, all of its resources, all of its technological expertise in everything from pharmaceutical development to digital finance, can contribute massively to the development trajectory of many, many countries around the world. But ultimately, what has positioned India as a future development leader has not been its assets, but its values. It has been India's multi-ethnic, multi-party democracy that has allowed it to withstand the challenges it has faced and come out ahead stronger and more resilient. It has been its support for free expression over decades that has allowed injustices to come to light. It has been its tolerance for diversity and dissent that has allowed reforms to take hold and institutions to progress. India's trajectory has been so strong because, not in spite of its democracy. Yet the headwinds against democratic rule are strong the world over. Within the United States and India, there are forces who seek to sow division, who seek to pit ethnicities and religions against one another, who wish to bend laws, abuse institutions, and wield violence against those who stand in their way. We saw this, of course, on January 6th in the United States back in, I have to think about exactly January 6th, the year of January 6th, 2021, just last year. How the United States and India rise to meet these injustices, how fiercely we protect our hard-won pluralism, how insistently we defend our democracy and individual rights, will determine not just our own trajectory, but that of the world that we inhabit. When my family emigrated from Ireland to America, we eventually landed in Atlanta, Georgia, where I attended high school. It was in Atlanta that Martin Luther King Jr., our country's most prominent civil rights leader, was born in a two-story home where his parents, grandparents, and two siblings also lived. Just blocks away from King's birthplace is the site where he is laid to rest alongside his wife, Coretta Scott King, a notable activist in her own right. Steps from their marble gravestone, surrounded by the circular waters of a reflecting pool, stands a small museum. Within it, as some of you know, are the artifacts and accolades of Dr. King and his wife, and those of one other man, Mahatma Gandhi. There, among Dr. King's Nobel Peace Prize and Coretta King's various book awards, sit the sandals, walking stick, and cotton dhoti of Gandhi, the man who inspired America's greatest civil rights icon and his own campaign of civil disobedience and nonviolence. In 1959, King himself visited India, intent on learning from Gandhi's own campaign of nonviolent resistance. He wrote later, "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted inspired by the vision of humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony. We may ignore him at our own risk." It was Gandhi's willingness to risk his own life, his own freedom, to embrace fully the struggles of his people that gave Dr. King the courage to do the same in America. King drew inspiration not from America's own founding fathers, it turned out, but from India's. And we are a more perfect union, striving to improve because of that quest for peaceful struggle, because of the insistence on common humanity that was fostered here in this country by Mahatma Gandhi. Across 75 years of shared history, that is the legacy of our two nations, to support each other, to inspire each other, and even to question each other on how fully we live up to our stated values. To be clear, now and in the years ahead, the United States sees India not just as a leader in the Indo-Pacific, but a leader throughout the world. Together, we can offer the emerging countries, the emerging economies of the future, a new development model, one rooted not in debt traps and dependence, but in economic trade and integration, one that supports and celebrates individual and national agency, and one that aspires to see all countries move beyond the need for assistance. A model predicated on engaging with a country's citizens and civil society just as willingly as it does with its government. A model that treats others as equals and collaborates on solutions without preconceptions or stereotypes. A model that recognizes that democracy, inclusivity, and pluralism offer the surest path to sustainable progress, where dignity is not reserved for the few, but endowed to us all. A model that is rooted in cooperation, not small-minded, but big-hearted. A model that at its core believes that we are all one family. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Administrator Power, for these moving remarks. Very insightful indeed. I'm Keshav Gupta. I'm the founder of the DIAS. We are an organization working on sustainable development goals and especially empowering youth and finding their role in it. Besides that, I'm also currently the president of the American Center's Esports Club here in New Delhi. And I'm also working as the youth working group coordinator for the World House project with Stanford University, which in fact is working on the lessons of Gandhi and Dr. King. So it's a personal pleasure to be here and to be moderating this question and answer sessions. For our audience members, if you wish to be recognized, kindly raise your hand and our ushers will bring our mics to you. In the interest of time, please keep your questions brief and succinct. And also when you do raise your questions, kindly state your name and your institution's name. I will use the moderator's privilege to ask the first question here. Okay. Thank you, Administrator. So, in your speech, you outlined the crucial nature of the partnership between India and the US. And looking at this decade, and in light of the food security crisis that the world is dealing with right now, how do you see India and the US playing a role together, especially to address this problem? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, let me first say that there are ways in which India is already contributing to meet urgent food needs. So one example would be the country of Ukraine, where I think nearly 200 tons of assistance have been provided, all forms of assistance, I think including medical. Afghanistan, which has been has long, of course, had its challenges, but particularly starting last year into this year has been in a very, very dire situation as the government there really struggles to manage the economy and the regular markets and banking system, have a hard time constituting themselves since the takeover of the Taliban. There, I think India has committed to provide 50,000 tons of wheat, which I cannot tell you how critical that is. I believe 35,000 tons of that has already either on its way or has arrived. So there are examples like that. That said, I know with the March harvest here that India's own wheat output, as I indicated in the speech, was much lower than people had expected. But I think that's very important. I also think we don't know. As we like to say in the States, many people are done with COVID, but COVID isn't done with us. And we know that if a new variant strikes, even as all of us collectively have made significant headway, I think, in contributing to the vaccination drive in developing countries, there may be a surge of demand again, and that is where India, again, with the model and the example that it has set domestically, but also has played such a critical role in producing vaccines and getting them out to the door to developing countries, often at a much lower price than other countries companies have offered. So those are some examples, but I would also not understate the importance of India's voice and its diplomacy. Some of you have followed the news. I spoke about Putin's effective, in a sense, blockade of Ukraine's ports, the 20 million metric tons of grains and oils that are so desperately needed to bring down global food prices and to reach those countries that get a very large share of their grains from Ukraine. As I mentioned, I was just in Somalia a few days ago. More than 50% of Somalia's wheat comes from Ukraine. It's just stuck. I think in Egypt and Lebanon, it's more than 80%, just stuck. And so, again, those countries are hustling and trying to get support from elsewhere. But I do believe that the diplomacy that India has done, has been a factor in the deal that the United Nations Secretary General struck. We hope that deal sticks. It's of course, with the bombing of the port of Odessa a few days ago, the deal was very much hanging in the balance, but the Ukrainians are trying to move forward with UN and Turkish support. But, sometimes, needless to say, we in the United States, we do things differently. We're out there. We're, often at podiums like this one, expressing views about this or that, and I know there are differing views on that approach, but there are a lot of different ways, publicly or behind the scenes, to try to urge policy shifts or different stances by a variety of actors around the world. And I do think that even the humanitarian exceptions policy that has been put in place when it comes to the wheat export ban is very, very significant, because when there are humanitarian emergencies, that's a place where India can look out for its domestic needs at the same time, in those very urgent circumstances that some countries are facing, it manages to be responsive.
Thank you. Thank you so much for outlining rather comprehensively all these different themes. Thank you so much, Administrator. We'll be now opening the floor for a few questions to our participants in here. So, ma'am, could you kindly...
Hi, I'm Tuba Khan. I'm a MTech student here at IIT Delhi of cybersecurity. My question is that ma'am mentioned how India has an impact, a global impact. It has an expertise in a global impact and global application. How do you see our country's evolution from being a food recipient to being a contributor, global contributor in the countries where USAID works? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's, in a sense, the turn that I was trying to speak to in my remarks, and that I am so struck by as I myself study USAID's history, because I'm a newcomer to USAID myself. I can't take credit for any of the programs you like. I can't take credit for any of them. The programs you don't like, blame me, because I at some point, don't blame the wonderful Indian nationals who are out there doing God's work every day. But I am really, really struck by the history. I gave the number in the speech of what share of USAID's assistance or support over the decades went into food aid and food security, and it's more than half. And that in 2010, because, Indian ingenuity unlocked itself, and, India became an exporter of food, playing such a critical role in global markets broadly and in developing countries specifically, then we've been shifting toward much more kind of catalytic seed financing, private sector partnerships, maybe blended finance where we bear, the first risk, but, just let Indian entrepreneurs go off to the races and do their thing. And the same is true with Indian civil society, where it's just, an awe-inspiring panoply. So what I think, though, is noteworthy is not only kind of, just the dynamism that exists, that one just has to set foot in Delhi or any part of the country to experience, the energy and the determination, and what we in the United States, of course, have benefited from with all of the immigration. Our country is so much stronger as well because of what Indians have brought to it. But it's not just that. It is actually the very fact that it used to be otherwise, and relatively recently. I mean, the credibility, the stature, the respect that that generates among countries that find themselves, let's say, in a version of the circumstances that India might have found itself, dependent, if not dependent, taking in, food support from outside when it knew it had arable land and it had this potential, but in that kind of before phase. And those countries, fully, equally capable, held back, by all kinds of factors beyond the control of the individuals in the country, legacies of colonialism, legacies of division, of conflict, the Cold War. There a lot of factors that have helped, that have contributed to the hamstringing of economic development. But when Indian agronomists and economists and tech entrepreneurs and women leaders, like your president, and so many others through India's history, but in the government, in civil society, in business here, it just has an authority, that expertise, because of the accelerated time frame in which you have achieved so much development progress, that when other nations that may have developed into more modern economies long before, or been exporters of this or that long before, it just feels different. And I also think I'm sure, although I haven't yet experienced these what we call triangular partnerships firsthand when we work side by side in third countries, although we're doing more and more of that, and we, the United States, want to do even more. But I think also the knowledge is very fresh here. I'm not somebody, personally, I've been involved in foreign policy and diplomacy, and I've been an academic, but I'm not somebody myself, who has figured out how to deal with changing weather patterns in the fields of my country, right? I'm not somebody who has led a vaccination drive, and an accelerated campaign, and personally fought disinformation, and personally, overcome access challenges in the deepest reaches of my country. Whereas India, the domestic experiences that your experts can bring to countries themselves, again, grappling with what such familiar, analogous challenges, I just think it can be incredibly impactful.
Thank you so much, Administrator Power, for this, again, very insightful response. Being mindful of your time, we will be taking one more question before we close our question answers session. So you can raise your hand if you'd like to. Gentleman over there, please.
Hi, I'm Swagatam. I'm representing this same institution. And my question is, so India is a very young, has a very huge number of young people, perhaps the highest young population in the world right now. So my question is, how do you think these people are going to play a role in the country's future leadership development?
How does the fact that India has such a young population play a role? Is that, yeah, great. Well, obviously, having large numbers of young people entering the job market is a source of great dynamism and fresh ideas. It also can be challenging, keeping up with the pace of young people entering the workforce. So, I think always keeping an eye on, domestic job opportunities, employment, going the last mile to those parts of the country that remain underdeveloped, those communities that haven't yet witnessed the same, kind of staggering trajectory that some parts of the country or some communities have. So, I think that there's that aspect of it. In the context in which I'm engaging, namely, what does India have to offer globally? Sub-Saharan Africa, a place where, as I indicated, and as many of you know, India has already done so much. I mean, that is precisely the population demographic, of most countries on the continent, and so here again, if you look at developed nations like mine, where you see either population, straight lines, or you see population declines, in many countries, your India's own absorptive capacity, its own ability to find economic homes and opportunities, and to take advantage again of all of the talent and the ideas and the creativity of young people, while not suffering again, some of the economic instability that other countries have experienced, just by not, in a sense, being able to keep up with that influx. As India tackles that challenge, which I'm absolutely confident it will, kind of getting the benefits while managing some of those risks, that's just a perfect example of my exchange, I think, with your colleague about, again, how those insights from civil society actors, youth leaders, private sector actors of all kinds, and government officials and development practitioners, again, those experiences are just going to be absolutely invaluable to countries that are grappling again with analogous, at least, population trajectories. And maybe just the last thing I'd say, and I know we're short on time, but is just that how, again, I know India has its, and the Indian people, have their share of challenges. I mean, it's, of course, this is when you have climate shocks of this magnitude, when you have a population as heterogeneous, as this one. I mean, and when there is still, massive underdevelopment and poverty in parts of the country, those challenges exist. But the hunger, for example, in like the countries I just came from, Somalia, Kenya, I was in Zambia and Malawi a couple weeks ago, the hunger for Indian expertise, for the lessons of these experiences to be imparted in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect, is hard to find words for. And so, again, that's just going to happen on its own. The United States may or may not, have an insight into it or a window into it. We like the idea of doing trilateral partnerships because we have, just as we've had in India over the decades, we have in 80 countries USAID missions that are primarily comprised of nationals of the countries in which we work, about 2/3 of our overseas presence. So for Zambia, Zambians, Malawians, Kenyans, Somalians in the countries I've just come from. And so we feel like we have a sort of field presence and a set of development objectives aligned with country national plans of seeking to reach their SDG goals. And so we think that, hopefully, again, in the spirit of partnership, that we can provide platforms or at the minimum connections, for Indian private sector actors, researchers, economists, young people, whatever it is. But regardless of whether, again, we are doing things trilaterally, those conversations are already happening, and that desire, again, to frankly to emulate the kind of poverty alleviation, the kind of economic growth, the kind of innovation that India has managed in such a relatively short period of time, that those requests, that hunger, I think is going to produce its own results and its own rewards in the years ahead.
Thank you for, again, a very deep analysis on this, Administrator. Out of the vast comments that you've made, to me, the two very critical things that have stood out for me is your empathy and the need to be together in all of this. So I once again thank you for the patience with which you've taken all these answers.
Well, can I thank the audience for its patience because we got a late start, and for I have empathy for you for the late start that we got, and I apologize, but I thank you so much for the wonderful questions. And I just close by saying, you know, all of the things I'm saying can sound abstract, but you who attend this formidable institution or who teach here or who have graduated from here, I mean, you are the people, you know, that I've been talking about over this last hour. You know, you are the people we've been waiting for. So I just can't wait to see what you do, not only here in India, but all that you can offer countries around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. We will now be inviting Professor Garg to share his closing remarks for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Power. That was a wonderful, wonderful keynote. And thank you so much for taking the time off from your busy schedule to be with us here today at IIT Delhi. I would also like to thank Keshav for moderating the Q&A today. Thanks are due to the USAID team and my own team at IIT Delhi for making this event possible. Finally, I would once again like to thank the audience for your patience, for being here with us, and apologies once again for the delayed start. I would like to invite you to proceed towards the lobby for some light refreshments. And for the press, for the media amongst us, we are now going to be taking a 20-minute break. After that, there is a press conference with the Administrator Power. And I would like to request you to have the refreshments outside and then come back to this room in another 20 minutes. Thank you.